be with you. We're going to talk a little bit about the virtue of prudence today. To give you an introduction to the four cardinal virtues, you've already talked about the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which are the most important in terms of their object, right? Because they deal with God. But the four cardinal virtues are super important because they're the ones that are the way in which we create our character in a certain sense. All of the virtues are important to us, but the four cardinal virtues are the meat and potatoes of the virtuous life. If you get these four cardinal virtues right, all of the allied virtues are going to be obvious to us. So we start with prudence, and we start with prudence because we start with the mind. We start with the intellect, the ability for us to have cognition about action, about ends and means. We believe that cognition is the engine for action, right? So we're using St. Thomas Aquinas's treatment of the virtues here, and we're going to talk about prudence. The Latin definition of prudence is recta ratio agibilium. That's right reason about things to be done, which is in distinction from the definition of art, which is recta ratio factibilium, or right reason about things to be made. And so there's a close correspondence that is drawn here between art and prudence, in the sense that they both deal with thinking rightly about how to construct something. The issue, though, is what are you constructing? In the case of art, when you become an artisan or a craftsman, you are deemed to be a good craftsman if you can, with consistency and efficiency, produce a product external to yourself, whether that's you're a bridge builder or you're a blacksmith or you're a sculptor. You can bring about on a consistent basis something that corresponds closely to the ideal, which begins in your mind. And so if you are an architect and you have in your mind an idea of what a house should look like, you need a craftsman then to make that idea actual through the actual carrying out of the plans and the building of a particular house with all of the details that are attendant to that plan. In a similar way, we, by our thinking about human action, our cognition with regard to what is good, true, beautiful, and how we should go about achieving those things, we make that come into reality through our volition or our action, which is dependent upon thinking properly about how to act. So prudence and art, very closely allied realities for human beings, and I think helpful to us because I think often we lose this idea of the art of living, or the idea that my human actions, the way that I act, is actually something underneath my control at some level. The more free I am, the more capable I am of shaping well my actions. And so prudence is the most important virtue to help us begin this project of creating ourselves into a greater image and likeness of God through the way that we actually act volitionally or freely. Just a little reminder of what we're talking about when we talk about a virtue, right? A virtue, the Greek word hexis, the Latin word habitus, both refer to a state of character. They are qualitative terms. They change the thing that has the habit or the hexis. They are not mindless realities. For both the Greeks and the Latins, the idea of a virtue or a vice in a certain way, but the idea of a habit, a habitus, is this idea that I have intelligently changed or modified the way that I'm disposed to act and then to be. I've changed my being so that my doing normally, consistently, stably is of a certain kind, right? So you might think of this in terms of a surgeon or a dentist or an orthodontist or an optometrist or some kind of position that requires you to have studied theoretically what action should look like in certain cases, and then through repetition of actually doing the process, becoming more finely attuned and consistent in your ability to do it. I think of, for example, my friend Dr. Paul McLeod, orthopedic surgeon. His thing was like fixing broken legs. And you can be sure that by the time he was done or retired, that he had a certain ease with which he was able to fix broken legs than when he started performing surgery for the first time. So this is the idea of a virtue or a habit, is that it's a firm and stable disposition to act well. It's a qualification of my being, that I've actually changed my being through a repetition of action to become more capable of acting in a particular way. What are these virtues, where do they sit within us? I think it's important to remember that we can think about our mind and our soul as having particular powers, and our sense nature, which is part of our bodiliness, as having particular powers as well. And so we will look at which powers of the soul or the emotions a particular virtue sits in, so to speak, or is seated in. Leading us then to the question of where do virtues exist, right? So there are four basic places that we kind of look to as being able to hold a virtue or to be qualified by a virtue. And the reason for this is that our emotions, so we start with the spiritual faculties, our intellect and our will, right? So when we think about the human mind, there are basically two functions of the human mind, or two powers that we have. We have the ability to understand, to reason. This is the intellect's power. And then we have the ability, based upon that intellection, to desire and to choose. This is ultimately the will, right? So freedom then is the combined effect of intellect and will, being able to cognize the world in a general manner and to make a deliberate choice about how I'm going to relate to that world. Whether that's my internal world as self-conscious, or the external world of things that I live and move and deal with, interact with as a bodily person. The emotions are interesting, or the passions are interesting, because they are kind of this halfway house between pure bodiliness and a kind of spiritual reality that's capable of being affected by our intellect and our will. So we're not saying that the emotions are entirely rational or that they are purely spiritual, but rather that the emotions are kind of this part of my bodiliness that begins to touch upon subjectivity. And in touching upon my subjectivity, I'm able to influence through the use of my intellect and my will. Okay, I can shape my emotions, whether that's anger or desire. The two basic passions, or the two emotions that motive powers that are traditionally identified. That's not to say there's only two emotions, but the two powers from which emotions come from are identified as the concupiscible and the irascible passions. Concupiscible comes from, you can hear that Latin cognate for cupidity or desire. The concupiscible appetite is this appetite for pleasurable things, right? So this is the source of romantic sexual attraction. This is the source of attraction to beauty. This is the source of attraction towards wonderful food and conversation in my bodily experience of that desire, right? On the other hand, there is also this energy drive, this irascible drive. If you're a rascal, you're somebody who is hard to put in its place or put in a corner, because you have a kind of stiff backbone. You're willing to stand up to the world. So the irascible appetite is this energy drive that gives us what we need to face obstacles and difficulties in life. It's ultimately the source of fortitude or courage. It's also the thing that, when it's weak and not formed properly, is the source of cowardice and fear, or daring, a kind of mindless, irrational lack of proper fear of what's harmful for us. So when we look at prudence, prudence is ultimately situated in the practical intellect. It's an intellectual virtue. It's like a changing of the way that we think, the way that we understand things. Justice, which is the second of the four cardinal virtues, is in the will. And then fortitude and temperance, fortitude being in the irascible appetite, and temperance being in the concupiscible appetite. Prudence is called the mother of all virtues. Why is this? It's because metaphysically, so when I talk about metaphysics, I talk about being as such, not just from a physical aspect of being, but also immaterial being. Anything that exists is and has being, and so metaphysics is kind of the study of things in their most basic existence, or most basic form, which is existence itself. So we talk about the transcendentals of being, right? And ultimately, these are things that are very closely allied with the being of God. The first of that transcendentals all have a particular character to them that is proper to all things that exist, right? So the first thing about being is that it exists, and there's a unity in that. But from this, we say that there's the transcendental of truth and the transcendental of goodness. And then some people would argue that beauty is a transcendental as well. It's something proper to all things that exist. But some would then say also that it's merely the intellectual perception of the goodness of a thing. So it's kind of the splendor of the truth, as John Paul II talked about. So why is this important? This is important because prudence is the first and most important virtue, because it's the one that deals properly with cognition of being. That is to say, what is this thing? Okay, so whenever you're interacting with the world, whether you realize it or not, you're always making judgments about what something is that you're dealing with. In difficult situations where it's not easy for us to get the information that we need or to understand the situation properly, we become more analytical in trying to dissect and analyze, like get to the heart of what something is. But ultimately, this is where volition starts. This is where human action starts. It's with the cognition of the being of something, and the being of something in its reality as it corresponds to my judgment of it is the idea of truth, right? So I need to form a true assessment of the world in which I'm living and acting if I'm going to act well in relationship with it. Prudence is important for forming this proper cognition about things to be done. How am I going to live my life? What am I going to do based upon the truth of the things that I'm dealing with, including the purpose of my life? Okay, so action should follow upon being. Action should follow upon being. Prudence is, again, right reason about things to be done. Prudence is the perfection of the intellect in terms of seeing clearly what is good and determining subjectively and objectively what is required to achieve a good through action. Okay, so prudence intellectually is going to propose an end or a thing for which I should act, right? And ultimately the will is going to have to elect to choose that thing, whatever is good. But the intellect is primary in the sense that it's the thing that makes apparent the nature of what I'm doing. So I need to have a proper conception of what should be done, which is dependent upon prudence, before I can carry it out through an act of the will. I need to see clearly the circumstances, the objective, the means, how it relates to my human flourishing or others' human flourishing, how it's good, in other words. One of the things that's important to remember about prudence is that prudence is not caution. We live in a very, very overly cautious world, a world that is in so many ways incapable of doing what is good, because we have such a low threshold of risk. We have of risk adversity. We're so risk adverse that we are unwilling to take a step out to accomplish something that's going to require that risk, right? We live in a world of contingencies and possibilities. Not everything is absolutely certain. And there are certain things in life that are only capable of being attained if one is willing to step outside of a false sense of need for security in order to go after it, knowing full well that you may not get it or you may be hurt in the process. Right, so this is the problem with helicopter parenting. The idea that I'm going to keep my child safe from all danger. Well, you're not allowing prudence to be formed properly if that's your approach to life. And you're probably you might keep your child totally safe and comfortable, but you're going to squash their ability to do anything noble or great, because those things require grit, resiliency, and a willingness to live in a breach of a lack of certainty, to be open to failure and risk, and to move on once you've experienced those things. So prudence would tell us, take your hands off the wheel in terms of if there's something good that your child needs to do to mature and to grow, don't sugarcoat everything. Don't put up padded walls everywhere. Let them feel incrementally the reality of the world. Let them gain that awareness and that knowledge of the world that will then sit in their memory bank and help them to do well as they get into bigger and better things. So prudence does not equal caution. All moral virtue is necessarily prudent, says St. Thomas, and every sin is a sin against the virtue of prudence. This is super important to us because I think we think of prudence as we think of it as a kind of cautionary virtue, a virtue that doesn't do noble things, and a virtue that maybe doesn't touch upon very much. It's more of this analytical thing. But the reality is that every sin that we commit is a failure in prudence, because it's a failure either in the proper conceptualization of the good or a proper carrying out of what is good through the command, which is part of the action of prudence. So there's three basic actions of prudence. Prudence requires deliberation or counsel. Like, you got to think about where you are, what's being proposed to you, and how you're going to ultimately get to what you're going to elect to do. And then there's a judgment, right? There's a judgment that my mind makes, my practical intellect make, that says, like, this is the way to do it. This is what I need to do. Have you met people that just are incapable of making a decision, who procrastinate or just are totally indecisive, right? That's a failure of prudence. The other failure of prudence could be to be rash, to be not to take counsel and to make judgments without any deliberation, right? So there's two sides to the coin here. There's two ways or extremes to be apart from what the virtue would require from you. So you need to be prudent, you need deliberation and counsel, you need a judgment, you need to be decisive, and then you need, from that judgment, which is an intellectual judgment about the good of something and how the good means of obtaining it, then you need the command or the imperium that lays the hammer down on your will and says, do it, and actually carries it out, right? This is a kind of strength of will, right? In prudence, if you fail in that third act of prudence, that is command, right? The will can waffle. We can be not indecisive so much as lacking the energy to actually carry about what I've set out to do or what I've decided is the best course for me in this particular situation. So to use an example for that, to make even like something as simple as, I'm gonna make for supper tonight, I'm gonna make my favorite salmon chowder. I go home and I've made that decision. It's gonna be good. Father Crane, Father Todd are gonna be there. I'm gonna make salmon chowder for supper tonight. Everybody agrees on it on the text thread, and it's up to me to make this happen. And I get home, I'm tired. I go to the refrigerator and the salmon's gone. Somebody ate the salmon. Didn't realize that. Now I have to go to the grocery store. Wasn't expecting to go to the grocery store. I've already deliberated about what we should do. I've already had a judgment about what the good thing to do is. Now the question is, is Prudence going to command the actions, the means necessary to accomplishing that action? Okay. Am I going to, despite the kind of lethargy of, I don't want to leave the house, am I going to get in my vehicle, go to Marketplace, get the salmon, and come back and, in fact, carry through on what was already decided, determined, and judged to be the right course of action for that night? Okay, so there it is. Those are the three actions of prudence. That's kind of what prudence is about. Thank you for being with me today. We're going to follow up with some allied parts of the virtue of prudence, which is important for us understanding in a more full way what it takes to actually be prudent. Thank you, and above all things, charity.